Continuous improvement comes in lots of different flavors and styles. I'm Bella Engelbach, and I'm inviting you to journey with me to the edges of lean. Episode 125. You Can't Do Lean Here, Customer Development Edition with Danny Nathan. Lean practitioners often discuss the importance of delivering value to the customer and understanding the customer's needs. However, Danny Nathan takes this to a whole new level with his unique approach to lean customer development. His business is a testament to this. Intrigued by his methods, I invited him to join me on a journey to the edges of lean, where he shares his insights and practices. Danny Nathan, welcome to the edges of lean.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm excited to have you here. I'm looking forward to our conversation because it's going to be one of those conversations about lean in places where people think you can't do lean. And those are always so much fun. So
Absolutely.
Danny, tell us about Danny, a little bit about yourself, what you do today, and what was your path to doing what you do today?
Yeah, absolutely. So today I run a company called Apollo 21. I like to tell people that we sit at the intersection of a management consultancy and a product design studio. So in simple terms, we help generally mid-sized to enterprise clients build new products within their existing portfolio, launch new ventures and venture building capabilities. And then we also build technology products to solve operational challenges.
Wow. But you didn't start out as a second grader saying, hey, this is what I want to do. So tell us how you got from what did you want to be, a firefighter, baseball player?
I think if you'd asked me in second grade, it was probably rocket scientist or astronaut or, something crazy like that. Ultimately, that didn't come to bear. I actually spent most of my formative years studying acting and actually majored in that through college. And after college, kind of pivoted away into a different creative career. I spent some time in the advertising industry, realized relatively quickly in that space that I just wasn't enjoying it. And so I took it upon myself to figure out where to go next and ended up in the world of technology and startups and innovation consulting. And I've spent the majority of my career in that space, either consulting or serving as head of product or founding my own companies along the way and just kind of trying to make all of that work and learning everything that I can.
Wow. That's really interesting. So when you were in acting as a career, I mean, there's innovation in there to a certain extent, right? Because
Sure.
you're bringing something to life, but it's something that somebody else usually has written, unless you're the writer. Was there a moment where you said, I need to do something that is really even more creative than acting?
It was less driven by creativity for me and more about, to be frank, a lack of desire to get into the world of professional acting and everything that sort of goes along with that. It's an incredibly difficult industry, as we've all heard stories of. Little did I know, however, that advertising is just about every bit as competitive and difficult to get into as acting. So I don't know that I made the right choice there, but I chose.
And it took you down this path. It was a stepping stone on the path.
Did eventually, yeah. I came up in advertising at a little bit of an odd time. It was right at the kind of birth of digital, if you will. So when I was in school, we were studying how to write TV commercial scripts and make magazine ads and things. And then I got out into the workforce and realized that wasn't particularly interesting anymore. And a lot of the companies that I was working with were just ignoring the technology side of everything, brand consumer relationship oriented. And that was a huge frustration for me and ultimately what led to the path that I'm on today.
Okay. So I'm fascinated when you say that you work with companies that are developing new products. What kind of new products? Is it a broad range of products?
Yeah, it depends highly on what the needs and the purpose of that company are. So we are industry agnostic. We've worked across anything from video-driven security to restaurants to Western sports to banking and a whole bunch of other stuff in between. And so generally when we talk about new products, it is some sort of technology-driven product. That's kind of our bread and butter and where we come from. And those products usually do one of two things. They're either designed to help that company scale and tap a market opportunity that they haven't already applied themselves to, or, as I noted earlier, kind of solving operational challenges and helping companies figure out how to do their business better and how technology can play a role in that so that it frees up people time.
And one of the things that I think we all know about innovation is it's great to innovate, right? There's this always this idea that innovation is good, but if you're not actually innovating something that is potentially of value to a customer, you're not going to make money off it. And it's great to innovate for innovation's sake. And sometimes innovations come along and they have to wait for a while until their time is right, to really make their way in the world. But you're focused obviously on helping companies develop innovations that are useful, that are valuable,
without question,
to their customers. And you have been using lean thinking, lean startup in that work. Can you tell me a little bit about how you came across that and how that became part of your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a voracious learner and reader, and I admittedly I go through sprints where I'll read a dozen books over the course of a couple of months because I want to learn something new and immerse myself into that world. And so, as I mentioned, I spent about 5 years at an innovation consultancy, and that really opened my eyes to the opportunities around startups and how enterprises can foster innovation and cultivate what I tend to refer to as an entrepreneurial spirit, that spirit of exploration and discovery. And so as I was digging into that world, Eric Ries's Lean Startup was, obviously referred to as one of the Bibles. And so it was one of those books that I picked up along the way. And of course, it resonated, I think, for me, similarly to a lot of people, because it gives a very clear-cut series of actions that one can take to move down the road towards the creation of something new, a new company, a new product, etc. And so, for me, as with many, it became a bit of a Bible and an operating manual, if you will, of how to go about building a company and building a product and understanding what the evolution of that product looks like. And so that was kind of the jumping off point for me. And then I just started consuming everything else that I could in the space and, learning along the way so that I could educate myself and have a greater lexicon for working with clients and helping them understand where those opportunities fall and how to work through the process.
So one of the things that's interesting to me about Lean Startup, and I have to admit it's been a while since I read the book, is that it's very focused or very applicable to products, particularly software products, where you can do those very rapid learning cycles, and you can test things out on the web and see how that all flies. So I would be interested to hear what you have learned sort of in addition to where you started with the Lean Startup, and what is Danny's contribution to this field of thinking?
Yeah, boy, you're asking for a summary of a career's worth of learning. So I will try to. I'll try to kind of.
You only have 35 minutes to give it now.
All right, I'll talk really quickly then. Okay. I'm kidding. I think that, as I said, the Lean Startup kind of created a jumping off point for how to approach and how to think about the efforts of building something new. And as you nodded to, testing things quickly, learning, iterating, et cetera. And what has become interesting to me as I've learned more and as I've progressed in my career and had the opportunity to explore that process with a variety of different clients is kind of the meaning that we have imbued to various aspects of the Lean Startup methodology and thought process. So a perfect example is, an MVP, and the book touts the idea of an MVP quite heavily. But when you really stop and look at it, especially today, we're off the cuff, I think 10 or 15 years beyond the published date of the book, the idea of an MVP has changed. It's gotten warped. It has gotten adapted to a variety of different people and organizations' needs in terms of how they want to characterize what an MVP looks like for their particular efforts. And it's really muddied the waters around, I think, the point that Ries was making in the book. And frankly, in terms of how I kind of view going about the creation of products and startups, et cetera. And I say that because an MVP, and if you think about it, minimum viable product, it already has product in the phrasing, in the terminology. And so you automatically assume that it has to be a sales ready thing. It has to be a product, something that you're ready to bring to market. And what I've learned over time is that it's almost a misnomer, or, you can almost break down the idea of a minimum viable product into varying stages. And so a lot of people question whether some of the very simple experimentation that you might do, like building a landing page and seeing how people react to it, or if they're willing to leave an email address, et cetera, qualifies as an MVP. And when push comes to shove, what I've learned is it really doesn't matter. You can call it an MVP if you want to, if that's what works for you or your org or whatever, that's totally cool. But if you are, a purist and you don't want to consider that a product because it's not actually offering a thing to the customer, that's fine too. And the reality is that what we're getting at with the idea of creating an MVP is learning as quickly as possible, mitigating as much risk as possible for as little cost and time expenditure as possible. And to me, that's kind of a major shift in thinking around the application of lean methodologies that I think we gloss over far too often.
I'm like, yes, that's so great that you say that. And it just made me think of an organization that I saw that had sort of adapted. It was sort of an agile / lean startup approach with a very big software system that they were building. And so their MVP, when they said we're coming out with an MVP, they had already done like months and months of work on it.
Right.
Brought it out, showed it to the client, and the client was like, oh, this is wrong, and 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 this is wrong, because they hadn't done all of those very small experiments, because they had broken it down into like, what are the critical questions that we need to answer, and how can we do those rapid iterations around those very small questions? Because I think they did get that. I that just like a light bulb went off in my head, Danny, because that was exactly, I think, what happened to them, why they came out with this enormous thing that was what they said was the MVP. And then everyone was like, oh, we hate lean, we hate agile, we don't like any of that stuff anymore, go away.
Right. Right. And we're seeing a lot of confusion around that. That's, I've certainly seen examples of what you're referring to as well. But I think what you've described is also a great segue to what you mentioned earlier around why we need thoughts like lean customer development and how that layers into the thinking around the lean methodology to help streamline that and to help companies understand how to bridge the gap between discovery and MVP.
So when you say customer development, tell me what that means to you. What are you saying?
To me, customer development sits alongside the product development cycle, and it is really geared towards the discovery of the purest pain point, for lack of better terms, the thing that you're trying to solve for any given customer group, and the idea of validating both the need, the potential solution, and the willingness of customers to pay for it before you ever start building it. And to me, that's massively important, and it's part of what we have lost in the years since since Lean Startup came out. Is everybody's so focused on their MVP and on failing fast and moving quickly that they've started to ignore the need to query the customer and to gain a clear-cut understanding of what exactly is it that you're trying to do for them, and will they pay for it?
Yeah, because as we discussed earlier, you can innovate like crazy. You can come up with all sorts of wonderful things. And if people don't want to buy it, you don't really have a product.
Right. Or at the very least, you don't have a business. And I think, for folks that are looking in the entrepreneurial space, business and product need to go hand in hand, of course.
Right. Yeah. I think, I sort of had in my mind, new Coke, the famous,
Right.
But we're not all Coca-Cola. Some of us are just very, very small, entrepreneurial companies. And you're right. If you make that mistake, if you put a lot of time and investment into a product that you cannot sell, even if it's a great product, then, sorry, you got to go find something else to do.
Exactly.
And explain to your investors what happened as well, which is.
Yes. And hopefully have a little money left to get back to them in the process.
Yeah. So customer development, lean customer development then is what?
I bucket the two together personally. I don't know that I could clearly define the difference between lean and strictly customer development. They just sort of get bucketed together in the same sentence for me. So if I say customer development, just assume there's a lean in front of it, because that's what we're here to talk about.
Okay. Yeah. So then what does that mean then about how close the product developers need to be to their customers? And how do they do that?
I think that part of what has gotten lost is the proximity to the customer. And what we advocate for heavily is revisiting that relationship and encouraging product folks and engineers and designers to get to know their customers, to ask the right questions, even to use that lean customer development process as an opportunity to discover what you might build. And it's less about necessarily validating the thing that you already have in the back of your head, and more about providing yourself the opportunity to discover what that thing could be. And so, in my mind, a lot of lean customer development is providing the opportunity to learn where you need to be heading, rather than assuming that you have figured out where you're going to head at the start, and then just working through the iterative process of creating that thing. Because if that's the case, then, to your point, you have a big bloated thing that you then start showing to people and then start asking them about, and you go, oh, wow, well, we've got 10 different features here and people needed 2 of them. So either we've wasted a ton of time, or we need to remove those features, or we now need to do a bunch of additional work in order to pivot those features into something useful. Whereas if you had simply started by asking the right questions to begin with, you might have only built those 2 features. And imagine, the months that you might have saved in the development process, where you could create just those couple of things, provide intense value, and then get feedback from that point forward.
It's hard though, isn't it, Danny, when you have an entrepreneur who is passionate about an idea, right?
Yes.
And what you're asking them to do is, I think, to hold on to that passion about the idea, but to be perhaps even more passionate about the customer who might benefit from that idea. And so do you ever find entrepreneurs who, when I'm thinking of maybe of your kind of your stereotypical engineer, I don't want to put engineers in a box, because engineers come in all shapes, sizes, and qualities of emotional intelligence. But do you find that there are entrepreneurs who really have difficulty then kind of, understanding the value of customer development and seeing customers in a different way than they have to learn?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. It is certainly a learned opportunity, or a learned area of expertise. And, it's human nature for us to fall in love with the solution that we have in our head, because we get excited about a problem, we come up with a way to solve it, and then we assume, rightly or wrongly, that the thing that is in our head is the same thing or the same solution that's in everybody else's head. And there's an adage that is, I think, starting to become an old adage, if you will, that as an entrepreneur, you should focus on falling in love with the problem and not the solution. And to me, that's exemplary of exactly what we're talking about. Or one might trade out fall in love with the customer for the problem in this case. So the idea there is that if you can fall in love with helping somebody solve a pain point, then you will worry less about how it gets solved and enjoy the process of solving it, and be more open to unique ways to solve that problem than if you fall in love with the solution that came to mind the first time you thought about it.
Yeah. And I think it's a leap for people to make. And like anything else in lean, then it requires, first of all, that you have to come into it with some level of humility. Like, hey, I need to learn something, right?
Yes.
I might have been the smartest person in the room, or the smartest person in my engineering class, or my biology class, or whatever it was. But right now, I still have things to learn, and that you might need other people to help you do that, right? That you're not necessarily going to be the person who can do all that and gather that information yourself.
Absolutely, without question. And, you nodded at something earlier, Bella. I think that part of the creating conviction around the customer development process, one, is helping people understand exactly what it is, demonstrating it for them as as they go through it, potentially for the first time, and helping them understand that the work that you're doing up front, the customer development work, the discovery that you're doing with customers, doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong. It's not about, I agree that you have to approach with humility, but it's not about creating moments of humility so much as it is creating enough learning today that you can create something with intense focus later. And there's a lot of folks who argue that an hour of customer development work today will save you 5, 10, 15 hours on the far end when you get into building. And I agree with that completely. Because if you're not building to solve a need, then you're going to build more than what somebody necessarily needs for that solution.
So let's talk a little bit about customers then, because customers also come in varieties, right? And
Yes.
I have seen, people sort of describing, well, who's my ideal customer? And, I'm perhaps looking for examples of that ideal customer and missing people who may actually be better customers. How would you advise an entrepreneur to start identifying a customer or a customer group to get to know?
So we have a pretty clear-cut process around that, and it actually starts with defining what the problem space is. And so there's kind of two ways to approach the situation. You either know what the problem is or have an idea of the problem going into it, in which case you can probably then derive some ideas of who the ideal customer might look like. You can start talking to those people, and over the course of your customer development process, which in my mind, entails n number of interviews with those customers, you will learn a ton and you will probably course correct over time to figure out which subset of that initial customer group is correct. The other side, or the other starting point, would be we don't know what the problem is. We just believe that there is a pain here. Let's go discover the pain. In which case, I think that the same process applies. You need to talk to a bunch of people, but in that case, you can cast a much wider net around who you're talking to so that you have greater opportunity to discover what those pain points are, in the hopes that you will find a pain that is worth solving for a large enough group of people that it will support a business.
Okay, so either way, you have a methodology that
we absolutely do. It all starts with talking to customers, and it's something that a lot of folks are scared of, that a lot of people don't like to go out and talk to people. And whether you're stopping people in the parking lot of a grocery store or cultivating a list of people who you're then going to sit down in a forum not unlike this to have those conversations with, the amount that you will learn by talking to people is immeasurable. I mean, I literally can't put words around how important that aspect is towards the idea of creating a valid and valuable product or solution that you can then build a business around. And so our process starts with lots of interviews, lots of discovery conversations, and it looks like that over a period of time. But as we get through those interviews, the interviews then sort of narrow in and they become more precise, both around the types of people that we're talking to, what type of customer profile they represent, but then also the questions that we're bringing to them. So, our interviews might start by casting a wide net and looking for problems. And then as we discover clear-cut pain points, we can then zero in on who we're talking to ensure that we have defined that audience correctly, and then eventually getting to the point where we have some semblance of a solution that we can tease. And we don't go straight into prototyping or anything. We start with a storyboard, something as simple as, hey, we've talked to a lot of people that say they have this problem. I'd like you to look at this little, it looks like a comic book drawing, and it's usually 3-4 frames. And you just kind of talk them through that moment of, here's the problem. Do you have that problem? Here's the emotion of the pain that it elicits. And here's how we might propose to solve it. And you get more feedback, and you get the benefit of having people explain to you what they think the features of that thing might be, rather than you're coming up with the features and then having to sort of test and iterate and change. So it provides immense value.
Wow. And you're engaging people's visual cortex as well as you're doing that. So it's not just about wondering or imagining. You're actually,
Right. But that's kind of what I'm getting at, Belle, is that it starts with sort of the imagination. And then as we learn more and as we work towards a potential solution, then we become more concrete about it and we start showing them things so that they can react and give us the input that we're looking for. And often what we'll find is we'll get halfway there with a solution idea and somebody will say, oh, that's cool, but it would be great if. And we just, it's that facepalm moment of, oh my God, why didn't we think of that? But that's amazing. That's such a great point to hit in the process, because that's your discovery moment. That's the moment where you go, oh my God, that's it.
And we can design something to do that. And then
exactly.
That's the engineering side. That's not so hard. It's the
no, but it's
really
also It's the core benefit of hitting that moment before you ever get to pushing pixels, writing code, anything like that. It's the value of learning those moments up front so that by the time you start expending higher levels of resources, putting engineers to work, putting designers to work, getting product people to think about what that roadmap looks like, et cetera, you're doing it because you have heard from n number of people that it will solve their problem, that they'd be willing to pay for it, that they like the solution, that it needs to be purple and not green or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so then it just becomes, in a way, it becomes rote execution, but not in a bad way, not in a prescriptive A, B, C, D way. It becomes execution of that thing that you're excited to have discovered.
Yeah. That's so cool. That's so cool. And so you're doing lots and lots of iterative cycles before you're doing anything expensive. And that really is the heart of lean product development, right? Is to do as much iteration as you can, as quickly and inexpensively, and with as good data quality as you need as you can. Because people always, well, I want to learn quick and fast. But it doesn't do you any good to learn quick and fast if you haven't also got some good data, like bad data will throw the whole thing off.
Right. And if you're learning the wrong thing fast, you are essentially creating an engine for bad data. Yeah.
That's so cool. So people must get very excited then as they start to get into this, and they start to see things happen, and the entrepreneurs start to imagine themselves how excited customers are going to be to use the product.
Exactly. And that's what I was nodding to a moment ago with the idea of creating that conviction. So it can be difficult to convince people that they need to spend the time talking to customers up front until you reach that point of, wait a minute, we're learning. We're learning something really valuable. We're understanding and gaining greater clarity around what we should be building, what problem we should be solving, and how we should be solving it. And that's the moment where you can see that light bulb click on in an entrepreneur or an intrapreneur or somebody focused on innovation. And they go, oh my God, I get it. This is why we're doing it, so that we understand where we need to go from here.
Wow. Yeah, that's great. That's really exciting. And so one of the things I'm wondering, Danny, is, there's a lot of people doing, things in this space. You have some lean design. We have, the Stanford design thing. We have, a lot of people who are kind of working in this iterative early space. Not to mention, all the people who are doing agile or some form of that. Is there something that you think that you're doing that is different from that, or in addition to that? And I'm not expecting you to be on top of what everybody else is doing.
Of course. I think that, look, push comes to shove, a lot of the underlying principles of the efforts that we're describing are attributable to a couple of key authors, thinkers, et cetera. And so in some ways, we're all fishing from the same pond. But to your point, there's a lot of different ways to approach, to carry the metaphor forward, how you want to fish. And, there's different lures and different rods and whatever. And so I think that the magic of what we bring to the table in particular is the focus on the upfront customer development effort and the rigor that we put into the discovery prior to building anything. Because we firmly believe in the importance of that lean customer development process and the value that it brings and the savings that it brings. And that's really the point of convincing that, that we find requires a little bit of help along the way, is that, yes, we know you want to move fast. We know that you want to get to an answer. And we know that 1 to 3 months of talking to customers sounds like the opposite of that. But the reality is that by spending the 1 to 3 months up front, you put yourself so much closer to, I don't know, call it the starting line or the finish line, whatever you want to call it. You get yourself so much closer to the goal of the product that you're going to build that ultimately it's like taking a shortcut. It's just one of those shortcuts that when you're looking at the map, you go, is that a shortcut? And then you get there and you go, oh, wow. Yeah, okay. That's great.
Yeah. And you're absolutely insuring yourself against the main cause of post-launch failure, right? The main cause, I think, of post-launch failure is when people don't buy the product that you've spent so much time and money investing in, and
if it's a physical product, getting it into a plant and all those things that you have to do. Right. And there are so many causes of late stage failure, and many of them are technical, but you're talking about before you even get to the technical side of it, let's just deal with why we have this product and making sure that we're delivering something.
Right.
And it's so, it makes so much sense in talking about it.
Effectively, we're talking about getting rid of we built a solution looking for a problem.
Yeah.
And that's where ultimately you find a lot of startups, to your point, fail because they've created something that is technically interesting or visually interesting or looks cool, but ultimately doesn't really solve a problem. And that's when you end up in a world of hurt where you've spent a ton of money developing a thing that you then have trouble selling. And so the process that we're talking about really, I won't go so far as to say it eliminates that possibility entirely, but it sure helps mitigate the possibility of ending up in that situation.
Yeah, and because you're doing it, talking to, as you say, a somewhat larger number of customers, you're not going to be necessarily swayed by the one or two potential customers who could have led you down the garden path. I mean, you are getting enough people to get better answers. What about customer observation? I'm thinking like the Adeo kind of thing. Do you do that, or is it all interviews?
No, we do that. It depends what stage we're at. So often, I talked about getting to kind of that storyboard stage. Often following that, we will then build out a prototype or something of that sort where we can then get into the nitty gritty of the UX and how something should function and where the sticking points are. And that comes down to some observation up front. And then, of course, you get into, well, how do you observe and understand what's happening within your product after it's live and in the hands of customers? And that could be observation in the truest sense, where you sit and watch somebody use your product and take note of where they seem to get confused, ask them questions, things like that. But it's also where a ton of the value of data comes from, because that data is almost like looking at a giant anonymized view of customer observation, where you're going, okay, 73% of customers seem to have a little bit of trouble getting past step 2 of the onboarding process. Clearly, we have a need there. And so it could be as simple as identifying the places that you then want to sit and actually watch people use it so that you know where they get confused. Or it could be that you jump straight into, aiming for some sort of solution, depending on where in the process and the product that observation comes to bear.
But you start with talking with people. Yes.
We always start with talking to people. Yeah.
Wow. Danny, how do people find you if they want to have a further conversation with you?
Absolutely. Best place to find us is on our website at apollo21.io. It's the number 1. And then I'm personally active on socials and very heavily on LinkedIn. I'm pretty much blah, blah, blah / among many on all of the socials. And of course, Apollo 21 is also active in social media as well. If you happen to be in New York, I also run monthly founders dinners and monthly innovators dinners. And those are live and in person as opposed to on the internet. So if anybody wants to sit down and have dinner, please give me a shout.
Wow, what a great idea. Actually seeing people. You find out how tall they are.
I know. It's become a novelty. Yeah, it's really exciting though. I've really enjoyed it. I've been doing these for about 6 months now after I moved back to New York City following a stint on the West Coast. And it's been a great way just to get back into the environment of New York City tech and innovation and meeting new people. And there's always interesting conversations that come out of these dinners.
Yeah, is there a different atmosphere between the East Coast and the West Coast with innovation?
Dramatically.
Tell me about it.
It can be hard to put a finger on, but New York is... I'll stick to New York because I don't want to blanketly speak for the East Coast. And to contrast it, I was in LA for about 7 years, and the types of companies that people are building are very different. The rigor and approach, I think, that people, particularly in New York, put into their efforts stands out as different. And I'm trying to be careful here because I've seen some amazing companies grow out of LA, and I don't want to dismissively just say, everybody in LA is lazy. But there is a different mentality, a different rigor, a different, for lack of better terms, kind of a fire that sits underneath the people in New York, and LA tends to have a much more laid back approach. And I think as a result tends to focus more on obviously media and entertainment and then consumer driven opportunities. Whereas New York, you see a greater variety of B2B type of companies that are being founded, and certainly more in the financial space, things like that.
Right. And some of those industries themselves sort of more intense and just by the nature of the industry. And yeah, very, but they go through very quick cycles, right? So,
Yes.
finance is what happened in the last 3 hours is what's really important. Yeah. Yeah. But that must be interesting though, in taking your methodology. I mean, presumably you have customers, your own customers in more than one location, but
Yes.
did you see a different sort of a cultural difference in how people accept the idea of customer development?
I think there's less of a cultural difference there and more of just an understanding of where the need falls. And as I mentioned, West Coast and LA in particular tends to be a little bit more media and consumer oriented. And so in some ways, it's actually a little bit easier to convince folks there that they need to be talking to their customers, because it's easier to understand or draw a direct line to what your customer is telling you when the thing that you're putting in front of them is something that you expect a customer to buy, a consumer, as opposed to a business use case, a piece of software that's going to be used in the workplace or something of that sort.
And I think that is a difference, right? I mean, that really is a difference. If you are thinking about an individual consumer, somebody who is going to the grocery store,
Right.
and I'm just thinking like, what kind of software is involved in that? Somebody who's going to be using an app to, get coupons on their groceries. That's really, that's different from when you're talking to a company. It's still dealing with individual people, but they're much more likely to be represented by a board or a department or something like that. Is it harder to get an idea of what is really needed then? What the need is, what the pain points are?
I don't find it harder to get to the pain point, especially because by the time a company is focused on spending money to solve a problem, you'd better believe that it's a problem that they really want to solve. And so in a way, it's almost easier because there's a clear-cut commitment to solving that problem. And it's usually an edict that's coming from the top down. Somebody at the top of the company has said, we're going to solve this. And the employees have a little bit less choice about whether or not they're on board with it. The other interesting key difference there is who's paying. And I realize that sounds obvious at a glance, but a lot of B2B software, for example, has to be approved by somebody internally. So it's an organizational decision maker who is dictating what the individual user will use.
Yeah, which is where you get the organizational decision makers saying, well, can we just get the vanilla off the shelf product? And the individual user saying, but really for our use case, we want something different. And, you get those kinds of situations.
Right.
As well. Yeah. Yeah. Wow. Yeah. I know I come to this show, know that I come from the pharmaceutical industry. And so we're in this really interesting situation where the people who were developing the products are really not supposed to be spending time with the customers at all. I mean, that's
interesting.
Being an ethical dilemma. That doesn't mean they can't, but it has to be done very, very carefully. And you have to be very careful of what you say to potential customers.
Of course.
Under regulations. So it's very easy for people who are developing products to get very excited about the science of their products and kind of separated from how patients or healthcare providers will actually be using the product. And then the payer is somebody else entirely.
Right.
It may be a government, it may be a health insurance company. So, occasionally, it's patients themselves. Like patients are only paying a part of it. So I can imagine there are other industries where it really gets broken up like that. Where whether it's very hard to the person who is going to be using the product is not the person who's going to be paying for it, and is not the person who's going to be making the decision. But all of those stakeholders have something to say about what the final product's going to look like.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that there's other areas, especially those that I think undergo similar regulation to what you're describing. For example, we've done a lot of work in the financial services space, and there's different but still regulatory considerations around how that
Yeah,
flows,
definitely.
and a lot of thought that goes into managing who has access to what data and at what level of seniority they are within the organization, and how you can manage the throughput of that work given all of those different requirements and restrictions.
Yeah, yeah. So that, I guess, means more customer interviews and just
Yes, that particular project, we spent a lot of time in discovery talking to a huge variety of folks across the organization to understand how the technology that we were building for them would impact and be utilized by people across varying teams and so on and so forth. And of course, in this case, it was focused on the actual movement of money transactions. And that added a layer of complexity that was quite interesting to work through and understand.
oh yeah, it must be fascinating to watch money move around.
Yes, especially at the scale that these folks were moving money.
Scale I couldn't possibly imagine. So, Danny, one thing that intrigues me about everything that you're talking about is you were saying that you start out with talking to a lot of customers, and you get to this point where you're kind of narrowing down, and I'm waving my hands, and those of you who are listening can't see me waving the hands with the narrowing down. That's a very heuristic process, or it sounds like a very heuristic process. It's not necessarily one that lends itself to strict data analysis, but are you using any data tools as you do that, or is it all the sort of the minds and the intuition and the discussions among the people who are doing the interviews to come to that?
That's a really interesting question. I have yet to come across a specific data-driven tool that is focused on the part of the process that you're describing. That being said, I would not go so far as to say that it is entirely intuition based. It's not that we're listening to 10, 20, 50 people tell us something and then just kind of, putting a finger in the air and going, all right, we think it's this. We are, to put it bluntly, we're manually collating and going through that data and looking for the trends that we can identify and the pain points that are repeated over and over again as we go through that interview process. And so it's less about there being a tool involved and more about actively listening to what the problems are that people are describing and then looking for the through line across that feedback.
You know what? I actually love that. I would have been a little disappointed if you said, we have this artificial intelligence tool that, that's looking for keywords and then writing summaries for us, because I think that you would miss a lot in that, because it's not just in the interview. It's not just what the people say. It's how they say it, right? Because you could then make a note, someone was very vehement about something, or somebody sounded sad when they said something.
Yeah, you're hitting on a really interesting point too, but we look for emotion a lot in that interview process, because when people get emotional, be it excited or frustrated or angry at whatever it is they're using or whatever the shortcomings are in their current process, that's a big green flag for us. It's a big indicator that we're tapping into something that might provide insider opportunity. And so we look for those moments of emotion, and we've learned to kind of tap into them. And when we see somebody getting emotional, upset, excited, whatever it is, we push on those moments so that we can really make sure that we understand what's driving that emotion.
So it's a very human process.
Oh yeah. It's most definitely a human process.
Hey, before you go, tell me about the name of your company.
Yeah, that's a question that comes up often. There's naming a company is a very greenfield opportunity, and it's one of those things where it's very easy to get stuck in lots of ideas. And I happen to be naming this company Apollo 21 around a time when I don't even remember what it was, but I was watching some TV show that took place in space, and I was thinking a lot about space exploration and the idea of moonshots and how that terminology has trickled down from, actual space exploration to the world of startups and entrepreneurs. And it just kind of created an alignment in my mind around the Apollo missions being the original moonshot. And interestingly, if I can nerd out for a moment, I was doing some research on the Apollo program, and it turns out that the last scheduled Apollo mission was Apollo 20. And so we started in 2021. The next mission would have been Apollo 21, and it all just kind of clicked into place for me in an interesting way that also gave me an opportunity to capitalize on my love for all things kind of NASA design. I have the old standards manual sitting on my shelf, and it's always fun to flip through and just kind of get that the look back at how they approach design. So
That's great. Danny, what's your one piece of advice for a young person starting out?
I have two that I waffle between, and if I'm forced to choose one, I'm happy to, but I would love to share both.
Go for it.
My first piece of advice is also kind of a personal mantra that I live by, which is fail beautifully. And for me, it's a constant reminder that in order to do something, we have to try. And if we try, inevitably we're going to fail. And that failure, in contrast to what we've been taught since we were kids, is not a bad thing. It's a learning experience, and it's a way to discover a path forward. So my first piece of advice would be fail beautifully. And my second one is it will always take longer than you think it will.
Oh, wow. Two great pieces of advice. I love that. And it will always take longer, right?
Always takes longer than you think it will.
Yeah. Yeah. But what you learn along the way might be great.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hey, Danny Nathan, thank you so much for joining me at the Edges of Lean. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too. Thank you so much for having me. I've enjoyed it as well.
This is Bella Engelbach, and I'd like to thank Danny Nathan for being my guest at the Edges of Lean. What did you learn from this conversation? What ideas did it spark? We would love to hear from you. Meet Danny at apollo21.io and on LinkedIn. Find me on LinkedIn or at leanforhumans.com. Or join me at the Lean Coaching Summit in Indianapolis in July 2024. Or comment wherever you watch or listen. Don't forget to subscribe. And check out all my friends in the Lean Communicators community, leancommunicators.com, where you will find lots of great new content every week. The Edges of Lean is written and produced by Bella Engelbach with support from Podcast Inc. This is a Lean for Humans production.